Today I'm honored to speak with Professor Deirdre McCloskey, a distinguished scholar whose work has transformed how we think about economics and history. In her own words, in 80s and 90s, she wrote 3 books on method, saying that economics, like other sciences, and like the rest of the life of a speaking species, has a rhetoric. These foundational works, The Rhetoric of Economics 1985, If You Are Smart 1990, and Knowledge and Persuasion in Economics 1994, examines the use of metaphors, stories, and epistemologies in economics, challenging economists to engage more thoughtfully with the rhetorical devices that shape their field. She urges us toward a grown-up science, one that acknowledges the influence of language, narrative, persuasion, and sweet talk in economic life. Beyond method, Professor McCloskey's works on the Great Enrichment, the unprecedented economic growth that began in the 18th century and has lifted billions out of poverty, is central to her scholarship. Her acclaimed bourgeois theology argues that the change in ideas, not in institutions or capital accumulation, was the primary cause of the Great Enrichment or commercially tested betterment. Today we will discuss the 2024 Nobel Prize awarded to Daron Acemoglu, Simon Johnson, and James Robinson. Professor McCloskey has been critical of these neo-institutionalist ideas, and I'm excited to explore her views on this award and her vision for a more human-centered approach to economics called Humanomics. Professor, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, that was an excellent introduction. You've obviously done your homework.
Thank you. I'm so happy to hear that from you. Ms. McCloskey, for us to start, in your article, A Statist Nobel, written following this year's Nobel Prize announcement, you described Daron Acemoglu as a B-plus economist. Could you share why you gave him this grade?
Well, there are lots of us. I'm a B-plus economist, and he is too. And the problem is there are too many of us to give all of us Nobel Prizes. So the standard that the Nobel Committee has set is not high enough. It should be A- or A. I mean, A like Hayek or Paul Samuelson, and then A- like Arrow, Kenneth Arrow. But B+, there are 100 of us. And it was and then the other two are not even B+. They're Bs or B-. I mean, on a harsh standard.
In your article at Wall Street Journal that was about a reflection on their book, Acemoglu and Johnson book, Power and Progress, you write that they believe, I'm quoting, they believe that the power of the state can and should be used to select the best of the goodies from the back. My question is, what is the problem with state handpicking innovation and redirecting technology?
Well, the problem is that people in Washington or London or Brussels don't know. It's hard enough to plan your day. You plan your day, you're going to do this and you're going to do that. But as any adult knows, it often doesn't work out. And that's okay. Then you plan again. You have to plan, but you don't, but to assume that you actually know what the future is going to bring is a childish mistake. And that childish mistake lies behind thinking that economists or even engineers can predict the future of technology or predict its effects. So it's a persistent, widespread mistake. And in the ancient world, there were all kinds of methods of predicting the future, from the flight of birds or the livers of animals. And our current technology is no improvement.
What you said remembered me of what Hayek said, that the classical liberal case is not against planning, it's against a type of planning that is monopolistic and forceful and it's
Yeah.
centered in one place. And Ms. McCloskey, let's talk about institutions. Many economists believe that the neo-institutionalist movement, starting from North and then today Acemoglu, was a scientific success in bringing back the importance of institutions like rule of law, property rights to the mainstream economics. But you have shown a skepticism on that point, and I'm
Um,
using one of the chapters of this book as my question.
yeah.
Why do you believe neo-institutionalism, in short, is not a scientific success?
Well, take the institution of slavery in the United States before 1865. Now, there isn't any question that that institution had influence, that it was important. Indeed, that's what we fought the American Civil War about, was this institution. But institutions don't work, don't do their job, in this case, an evil job, if people don't believe in them, are not ideologically committed to making them work, or are themselves bad people who make good institutions work badly, or virtuous people who make bad institutions work well. I mean, it's possible to imagine slavery, as some people do, I think it's wrong, as a sort of apprenticeship for Africans. It's a crazy idea. But if it was done sincerely by ethically motivated people, it might have worked much better than actual slavery did. So my example, my favorite example of this is the three Soviet constitutions, 1920s, 1930s, and then the third one in the 1970s. And they're beautiful institutions. They're beautiful documents. But in all three cases, they were operated by criminals, by thugs, by evil people. So it's I may make a joke. Neo-institutionalism is profoundly superficial. It's about the institution. It's about the surface, and it doesn't get down to the ethical and ideological foundations of human society.
Let's continue this conversation on institutions. I think in your book you reference Peter Botke and
Yeah,
his idea that price theory in the hand of Mises and Hayek was institutionalist in nature. In
yeah,
other words, that without the existence of a rule of law, property
yeah,
rights, the type of free market wouldn't exist. But in your article, Critical Reflections on Peter Botke's The Struggle for a Better World, you
yeah,
argue that Austrians should reject that view. And my
yeah.
question is, why do you think Austrians should reject that view? And another question is, what's the difference between how Austrians, like Makhlouf, look at institutions and how no-institutionalists like North and Acemoglu look at
Well,
institutions?
I was just reading yesterday Mises's book called Socialism. And in the book, he has a long passage, in which he says, look, all human action comes from people's heads, from their soul. I would say, as an Anglican, it comes from individuals. That's what he's saying, and he disdains the claim of the socialists he was arguing with. By the way, in a very fair-minded way, that institutions like seizure by the state of the means of for deduction can work all by itself, that if you just do that, you're all set. Nowadays, at the World Bank, the doctrine is this: pour institutions into a country and stir. It's like making a cake or something, stir. Well, that's not how society works, as Mises said. And the problem with Pete's love of neo-institutionalism is that the only institution of institutions that can change institutions is the state. And that's so non-Austrian. And Pete, who's a wonderful man and a wonderful scholar, I think he's got a deep contradiction here, because you have to have a World Bank to have this stupid policy of add institutions and stir, and Pete, who's a leading Austrian and should be honored that way, he turns to the state in a way that Mises would not have approved of. And I don't approve of it either, because I think that human institutions like language or the family or for that matter, the state, all depend on ethical foundations. And that's what Mises said. So by the way, did some other Austrians, like Fritz Machlup, as you point out, and Pete's professor at NYU, Lachman, and his main professor, Israel Kirzner, is a rabbi. He's a leading American rabbi. Come on, Pete, get the point. You got to be a rabbi to found an ethical, well, not just ethical, a successful institution. And that was the point of the first of my 3 books in the trilogy that you mentioned on what I call the bourgeois era. The first book was about ethics, and it said, look, this claim that business people don't need ethics and capitalism is just, you just introduce property rights and the rule of law, and then you don't need to think about ethics. Some Austrians think that way. The Austrians that get it right do not. And by the way, the rule of law, which sounds so simple, itself depends on ethics. You can have a bunch of rules, as Doug North said, the rules of the game. And this was a big mistake that he made. You can have a bunch of rules, but and it sounds, oh, we're going to follow the rule of law. Suppose the laws are unethical. Suppose the laws are unjust and evil, like the law is that Jews should be exterminated. Are you going to follow the rule of law? So it's as I said in my joke, it's profoundly superficial.
One question comes to my mind right now, that if the good thing about so many people say about neo-institutionalism is that what they say, the theory that they have, has some practical things to offer. Like if you're a World Bank, you would like that type of ideas, that just if you have good institutions, good rules, good policy, then the growth will happen. But it seems it's more complicated. And my question is, can this type of institutions like World Bank, IMF, or states help in the process of having a more like ethical society? Or it's something that is not engineerable? You cannot engineer it.
It can be engineered a little bit. I mean, obviously, if you abolish the institution of slavery, as we finally did in the United States, then that's better than having the rules of the game saying, oh yeah, slavery's okay. And furthermore, you can chase escaped slaves in the North legally and make them come back into slavery. So it's a step, and it's okay. I'm not against abolishing slavery, but as the history of the United States, and in particular the American South, shows, if you don't believe it, then you get what you get in the famous book, One Kind of Freedom. You get a reimposition of segregation and the evils of hierarchies between black and white, which, by the way, are being revived by Trump right now. And so you get what's called in the United States Jim Crow, which was our name for apartheid. In fact, the Nationalist Party in South Africa sent a delegation to the United States in the 1920s to find out how to do apartheid. We invented it. We in the United States. This is appalling. So then we had to have a civil rights movement to try to change people's ethical attitudes. Now, there were institutional changes. I'm all for the Voting Rights Act. I'm all for the right. Okay, that's good. But it doesn't work if the implementers, the officers, are criminals. It's about to happen under Trump. We have he's going to do some, from an economist point of view, free market economist point of view, some good things, but he's going to do a lot of fascist things, and it's the rule of law. So institutions by themselves are, I say again, profound. That view is profoundly superficial.
You also mentioned not only it's superficial, but sometimes in getting historical facts, they're completely wrong.
Yeah.
And I would like to reference your book, In Beyond Positivism, Behaviorism, and Neo-Institutionalism in Economics. You write that Acemoglu, in short, had gotten the history embarrassingly wrong in every important detail. And then later in your trilogy, especially the bourgeois dignity, if I'm correct, why economics can't explain the modern world, you mention Nicholas Crafts and the fact that he said there was no obvious improvement in institutions at the time of the Industrial Revolution. My question is, are neo-institutionalists getting the history wrong when they link Glorious Revolution or Industrial Revolution to the change in institutions?
Completely wrong. Look. I loved Doug North. He was a splendid man. He was he was a communist in his youth and a pacifist in the 1940s. So he wouldn't serve in the army, but instead he served in the Merchant Marine, which was much more dangerous than being on a battleship. and he was an admirable guy, and a charming man, a wine fancier, and he was most amusing. He spoke excellent French and blah 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 blah. So Doug was a good guy, but this glorious revolution stuff, namely the 1689 conclusion of the invitation that the English gave to the Dutch stadtholder to come to England to become their king, and with Mary, didn't change much. It ended the struggle over the power of Parliament that had dominated the 17th century in England. Now, the power of Parliament was transcendent. And you didn't have, as you had across the Channel in France, the transcendent power of the king. All right, the king was still important, but much less important. But that didn't change much about the economy. And it's just completely wrong historically to think that much changed. There have been quite serious statistical studies of this before and after 1689, and things don't change. Doug didn't read very much after in his maturity, and he didn't read legal history with any seriousness. So he didn't realize, in the words of a famous title of a great book of the 1890s, he didn't understand the history of English law before the time of Edward I. That was I'm probably going to get the date wrong, but approximately 1282. And English law, contract and property, tort, its whole structure was finished by then. And it didn't change. Laws of property didn't change after 1689. The power of Parliament meant that enclosure could go forward, and I've done a lot of work on that, but enclosure was not that important in the economy. And so if you start to go into the details of the history that Acemoglu and Johnson and Robinson sort of skim through in very eloquent prose often, especially when Robinson's involved. It looks very nice. Oh, yes, that's beautiful. It's wrong. I mean, I don't mean they're wrong about every single little detail of history, but Robinson, for example, is dominated by his experience in Nigeria. That's his country. That's what he points to all the time. And he's been very much influenced by anthropologists. Well, you know, I've been influenced by anthropologists, but I don't give up my economic thinking just because Clifford Geertz was a friend of mine. I converse with them and try to improve my economics by thinking seriously about the kinds of thing that Cliff was interested in. And poor Doug didn't. When he has this terrible book, I guess it's 2004 or something like that, where he keeps saying, we need to know about the source of ideas. Well, we certainly do. But he says, the way to find out the source of ideas is to go to the brain scientists, namely people who study the organ called the brain. Well, you know, that's pretty silly. That makes the mistake of assuming the brain is the same thing as the mind, and it's not. It's clear that the brain supports the mind. I understand that, but it's so there's a kind of I don't know. Well, B- quality to the history that these people peddle. It's quite common among non-historians. None of these three people who got the Nobel Prize are historians, not serious historians. They haven't ever been employed in a department of history. I've been employed in 3 excellent departments of history. Come on, I'm a historian. I'm not an archival historian, I'm an essayist, but I'm a historian. And I take the facts of history seriously, they don't.
Another thing that I can say is that you get the historical facts and the facts about human beings, not only seeing them as maximizer of utility and narcissistic.
Well, that's the trouble. He says, Doug and then Acemoglu and the rest, they say, we got the rules of the game. and then they go back to game theory. Then it's Max U all over again. One of the irritating things about Doug, and I kept saying this to him, but he didn't pay any attention, or, is that he said, I'm revolutionizing economics. Ooh, yay, bravo. Good for you, Doug. And he said in particular, I'm overturning neoclassical economics because the neoclassicals, as he kept calling them, it's a stupid way of talking about them. But anyway, the neoclassicals ignored institutions. Now this is pazzo. This is loco. This is insane. Ronald Coase ignored institutions? What are you talking about? Did Robert Fogel, the great economic historian who got the Nobel Prize the same time in 1993, it was North and Fogel. I wrote the citation to that prize, by the way. It's mostly my prose. And so I know what the prize was for because I wrote it. And Robert Fogel and Stanley Engerman studied slavery. What? They studied it, as both of these people did, Ronald Coase and Robert Fogel. They studied it with the tools of neoclassical economics. So it was silly to say that, but then he ended up and all of them do. Acemoglu is very much this way. They repeat, they then immediately go back to Max U. And they don't acknowledge the force of ideas in human history. And this is a big, big mistake. As Mises says, as anyone who's serious about history knows, ideas matter. And the ideas don't come from brain science. They come from the culture, they come from the conversation of humankind. And the way to go, if you want to know about the source of ideas, is to the humanities. For 4,000 years, human beings have been writing down their reflections in poetry and epics and philosophy and history of what motivates people and how humans are, and that's where to go. And Doug didn't understand that, and neither does Acemoglu.
Ms. McCloskey, you mentioned humanities, and I would like to ask my question about the Great Enrichment. What you call the killer app of humanomics.
Yes.
If institutions weren't the primary reason, what caused it?
Well, what caused it was, in a word, was liberalism, which is not, by the way, about the Enlightenment. There's a kind of sloppy historiography that mixes the Enlightenment, where you do math and science and you claim to be rational like Kant, with liberalism, which Immanuel Kant, being a state functionary in the Kingdom of Prussia, was decidedly not. He was not a liberal, politically speaking, or in terms of free speech, or in terms of freedom of the press. He couldn't be, because otherwise he would be fired from his job as a professor. So liberalism is a separate movement. It starts happening in the 18th century. And it's very unusual. It's the claim, as I've been saying the last year or so, that what we need is equality of permission. We don't need equality of outcome or equality of opportunity. Those are unattainable for reasons I could go into. What we need is equality of permission. Women are allowed to be airline pilots. A poor person like Abraham Lincoln is allowed to become the president of the United States. a poor boy like Edison is allowed to become an inventor and so forth. And that equality of permission was an extremely powerful idea. And in another bad book that Doug North was involved in with John Wallace and Barry Weingast, both of whom are wonderful people and splendid scholars, they talk about open access orders as against closed access orders. This is just making up new words for hierarchy, inherited hierarchy in the old days, and liberalism now. Why they did this, I don't know. I ought to speak with John about this in more detail. But this is just elegant variation, we call it in English, for liberalism, the idea that all people are created equal, the idea of equality of permission.
And Ms. McCloskey, I would like to know your opinion about the Nobel Prize in general, because I believe in the old days, Nobel Prize rewarded works in humanomics. Like, if I want to say some example, Ronald Coase Nobel, Hayek, Herbert Simon, Buchanan, and recently, most recent than those ones, Vernon Smith. But in recent years, it doesn't seem that way, and it's not that much rewarding the outsiders. And my question is the classical question that's, what do you think about the Nobel Prize? Was it beneficial for economic science or not?
No, I think on the whole it was not. I mean, I remember when it came in, and the third prize given to, the second prize was given to my mother's longtime mixed doubles tennis partner, Paul Samuelson, in case you needed to know that. They played tennis together. I didn't ever know Samuelson, but they did. My parents did. But very soon it was given to Milton Friedman, and hey, I remember it well. And as you said, at first it gave it to giants, Hayek, Coase, Friedman, Arrow, Samuelson. But now it's gotten down to the B plus economists, or the B, flat B, not plus. And I don't know why it's gone wrong. I think it's because, well, I don't know. I can think of kind of nasty stories like the people on the committee are third-rate economists. And third-rate economists really like good second-rate economists. That's how it goes in all fields. It's not just economics, but in the world. Mediocre people are made very nervous by A-plus people. They're so good, and I can't even come close to that. So I think they like very much kind of influential routine scholars, and I can't. That's why they've given something like 6 prizes to finance, essentially. One prize after another is modern finance. I was there at the University of Chicago when modern finance was being invented. I ate lunch every day with the founders of it, like Fisher Black and Myron Scholes. I was in economics. They were in the business school at the University of Chicago, but I didn't understand what they were doing. They were inventing modern finance. How many times do you need to give a prize to modern finance? 6 times? I don't think so. But so it's sort of second-raters who do, actually not second-raters, third-raters who do that. So I'm very disappointed by the way the prize has gone. I mean, for one thing, it would be very healthy not to always give the prize. If there was someone who, I mean, if they held up the standard of A minus, A plus, no B minuses like me, no Bs like or B minuses like the other two people who got the Nobel Prize. No, we're going to stick with the A's. Then they wouldn't always give the prize. And that would make sense to me.
I think our audiences like to know, who do you think today alive is an A+ economist or A-level economist?
Well, it's very hard to think of one. I mean, this may be a natural development because economics had this explosion of, well, for example, the mere size, the number of academic economists enormously increased from the 1960s on. So they're all over the place. And I find it hard to think, I don't pay very close attention to the fashions in economics these days, because I've seen the fashions come and go. I mean, I could give you a litany of all of them, and I sometimes participated, and I was thinking, oh yes, linear programming, that's the future, because that's what they taught me in graduate school at Harvard. Linear programming, that's the future of economics. And Samuelson and Solow and a teacher of mine, Bob Dorfman, wrote a famous book making this claim. Well, 5 years after I left Harvard, it had died as an intellectual program. And this happens over and over and over again. So we're kind of fashion ridden. And I can't think of it. Essentially what you're asking me is who hasn't gotten the prize who should by this high standard? And I can't think of a single one.
What about Mr. Kerzner? Do you think?
Kerzner? Oh yeah. Well, actually, wait a second. Yeah, okay. I withdraw my last statement. Israel should get the prize, but of course he's not gonna. Yeah, you're right. Israel Kerzner should get the prize. I remember trying to read Israel's books back in the 1970s, early 70s, because they were published by the University of Chicago Press. So I could get them free, or at least at a heavy discount. And I didn't understand them because I was so much a Samuelsonian economist. Max U, subject to constraints. That's what I thought the world was. And this idea of alertness and so on. And I was actually a student of entrepreneurship, at least I thought of myself as one. But I didn't get Israel. I knew that he was saying something, but I didn't understand it. It took me a long time. Yeah, that's right. The Kerzner. Well, I can think of others. Sam Bowles ought to get the Nobel Prize. And Sam is, I don't know very well, but he's a man of the left, but has moved kind of to the center. And he's very imaginative, and he's a very good economist. And maybe Sam should get the Nobel Prize. And let's see. Let me think about it. I don't know. Sam would be a good one. Kerzner would be another. I don't know. There aren't too many, put it that way. Whereas there was a crop of first-rate economists. By the way, lots of them were Jewish. And this was a consequence, of course, Hitler's terrible destruction of the most intellectually advanced community in the world, namely German science and scholarship. He wrecked it, and the people moved to England or the United States or France, especially the United States. And before the war, most American universities, especially the private universities, were frankly anti-Semitic and didn't allow Jewish scholars to flourish. After the war, that changed. And so there was this influx of Jewish economists. And that was great. That was wonderful. And then mathematics, especially Paul Samuelson's version, was introduced. As you mentioned Herb Simon, and he introduced some other kinds of mathematics. He was a wonderful scholar, very broad. you know, there, but so here's what I'm saying. We just may have gotten that big input of first-rate intellects taken care of. And now we're down to giving the prize to James Robinson, who's not even an economist.
Ms. McCloskey, my next question, I want to ask it because you mentioned Friedman previously in your talks. It's not directly about the Nobel Prize, but it's fascinating. In your book, in this book, you mentioned that Friedman once told you he regretted writing his article, The Methodology of Positive Economics, a piece that since then has become almost a Bible in economic methodology. Could you tell us more about that conversation?
Well, it wasn't a conversation. It was a comment in a letter that he wrote to me praising my article called in 1983, I think it was, called The Rhetoric of Economics. And in that article, and then in the subsequent books that you mentioned, I tried to get economists to understand that the philosophy and history and sociology of science doesn't support the naive positivist formula that both Samuelson and Friedman advanced. It's important to remember that Samuelson at the same time was making the same claim as Friedman was. Friedman's article has, for some reason, gotten more famous. And as you say, it's taken as holy writ. You know, the Torah of economics is one rule. Have a theory and have observable implications, and that's all that matters, and blah, blah, blah. All this nonsense, which no science has ever followed. History, physics, no science. But they're so wedded to this, and you get some very foolish results out of it. It's one reason that I left the University of Chicago in 1980. I had tenure there in economics and history, but I was increasingly frustrated by the dogmatic application of positive economics. And they were pretending not to have ethical opinions. Now, Milton was somewhat more open about this, but people like Gary Becker and so forth, as much as I admire Gary Becker as an economist, would go around saying, oh, we just do positive economics. We don't have any politics or ethics. What a lot of nonsense. This is crazy. That's not true. It's not honest. It's not an honest rhetoric. And then on the other side at Harvard, they had a socialist convictions, and they denied it and said, no, we're so there's a deep naivete about how science works. People who don't know the slightest thing about how physics, for example, actually works as a scientific field. I get the news from Thomas Kuhn or Paul Feyerabend or Feynman, Richard Feynman. They tell me how physics actually works. But this message didn't get over into economics, who think they're the physics of the social science.
As the last question, Mrs. McCloskey, you mentioned the future of profession of economics, and in your book, Bettering Humanomics, you offer we should get serious about the richly descriptive yet ethically restrained human science of economic life called Humanomics. How do you imagine the future of profession will be? Will it go to the direction of Humanomics? If not, what should be done for what you call a serious science of economics?
Well, what should be done is for people who are serious, justice in the world, and there's not. Bart Wilson at Chapman University, he and I are working on a paper, a survey article, which we hope will be published in the JEL. We haven't submitted it, so we don't know, called Humanomics, a survey. And what I hope, what should happen is that serious people like Bart and me and others should do first-rate work informed by a broader knowledge of the other social sciences and legal theory and novels and painting and of the whole of human culture and history especially. And I'm working on a book now, which is a kind of a, takes up some work I began as long ago as 50 years ago. When you're 82, you start making statements like that, on English open fields and enclosure. And I hope that it's called an essay in Humanomics. And it's meant to show that you can do serious quantitative work and yet take seriously the deep qualitative questions that frame the quantitative exercises. And this is something, for example, the present fashion in economics for regression analysis gone mad on large data sets as what economics should do, without these people understanding basic economic theory. And this is ersatz sociology in ignorance of the sociological tradition, and it's not good science. I've been notorious in economics for saying that tests of statistical significance in the absence of a substantive loss function are meaningless. And economists sort of say, oh, Deirdre doesn't like asterisks in tests of significance or something. I don't understand quite why, but and it still hasn't changed anything. So doing the regression analysis on putting a hyperplane through a bunch of 100 variables with allegedly 100 observations each just doesn't work, because they use statistical significance as their criterion.
Ms. McCloskey, thank you for joining us today. I don't like to end the interview. Because of that, I'm going to ask another question. And what is your recommendation for a young economist, for a future economist who wants to follow this profession?
You have to be courageous, because you have to face yourself every morning in the makeup mirror or the shaving mirror. And too often I get a reply from young economists, even those who understand, say, my criticism of statistical significance, or even those, and this is not as common, who understand my criticism of neo-institutionalism. They say to me essentially, but I have to get published. So I have to do this stuff. And to that I say, don't you have any self-respect? Now, I'm in a poor position to say that, because in my career, I believed every stupid thing I was presented with. I took more econometrics than most people of my generation, for example. And I thought that statistical significance was how you did it. I was a Keynesian. I was a social engineer. I was a positivist Chicago school economist for a while. And so in the positions I was in, I could get the best job in my class, my PhD class. Poor Tom Sargent had to go to Minnesota. I got to go to the University of Chicago. If you see what I mean, see how absurd that is. Tom's got the Nobel Prize a long time ago. And I don't really think that Tom, well, I don't know, he's B plus, A minus. I don't know how to think about Tom. But anyway, so I was lucky so far as position is concerned. Whereas I'm recommending that these young people be courageous right away. And not be courageous. I was courageous, but I was following the trend without realizing that it was wrong. So I'm asking them to stand against the trend, and that's hard to do.
Yes.
But on the other hand, I always say to them, as I said a few minutes ago, do first-rate work. If you're going to stand against statistical significance, use a substantive loss function to tell how big is big instead of tests of statistical significance. If you're going to do institutional analysis, make sure you get down into the ideas, the ethics, the ideology that in fact makes it work. If you're going to do Max U economics, make sure you have a broad conception. Well, actually, you have to be a little bit more than that, but understand that there are parts of human behavior that are not subject to Max U, and so on. So do it deep, do it thorough, be impressive in your work. And then it turns out that if you do that, people pay attention. Even people who don't understand criticism of statistical significance or neo-institutional economics, if you do it and show that it's scientifically correct, that's the key point. Then the other scientists, I've seen this happen a few times in economics, finally get the point. Or at least they say, well, Ronald Coase does really good work. I can't think what's wrong with him. Maybe he should get the Nobel Prize.
Ms. McCloskey, thanks a lot for joining us today. It was a pleasure and an honor to talk with you.
Okay, dear.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Ciao. Be, as my dad says, be good. If you can't be good, be careful.
Thank you. Okay.